Good evening. I kind of got busy with working on doors and trim and stuff this morning, and just didn't think about doing my devotion. And then I did. Well, it was kind of late. Anyway, pretty late for my devotion this night, but we're going to look at Hebrews chapter 3. I'll talk briefly about it, and then, a lot of what we see in Hebrews talks about the majesty of Christ, and I want to, touch on some of that from these first few chapters as well. But in chapter 3, we are reminded that the Son is faithful. That Jesus was faithful to God in all things, and that's why we still refer to him as the Son of God, the Holy One, the one who did not sin. That he is the high priest, and he serves as that high priest for us. And in the Jewish tradition, the high priest, I've said before many times as well, but the high priest once a year, maybe not just, but on occasion, went behind the curtain to offer a sacrifice. And this was just an honor for one of the priests to serve as high priest. But and all of those high priests died. Jesus, the high priest, even though he died on the cross, God raised him from the dead and he lives forever. So Jesus serves as our high priest, and it was a reminder, especially for the Jewish people, that they didn't need to have this high priest anymore, because Jesus was the high priest and he was faithful always. And this writer of Hebrews talks about Moses. He says, for this one, and the one is capitalized, that's referring to God or to Jesus, and especially here was referring to Jesus, was counted as worthy of more glory than Moses, because the one who built the house, Jesus, God, has more power and more honor, and Moses too was served as high priest, served as the leader, but he isn't the high priest forever. He was faithful in his house. He led the people of Israel as God asked, but the people of Israel, and he talks about that in here too, that the failure of the wilderness wanderers is the last part of this chapter 3. That the reason that none of those who left Egypt saw the promised land was because of their unfaithfulness, because of their wandering away. When Moses was up on the mountain, talking to God, what happened? But they fell away. They built an idol. They cast all of their gold and stuff into this big idol, and God saw it and says, you better get down there. You see what these people are doing, But so the call to be faithful is very prominent here in chapter 3 of Hebrews. The writer quotes from Psalm 95 in verses 7 through 11. He says, therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, he's quoting from Psalm 95, today if you hear my voice, do not harden your hearts as in rebellion. And then that same verse is repeated again in verse 15. So it's just a reminder for us as how important it is for us not to harden our hearts against God, not to, because the Israelites complained to God. If you remember the story, well, we had it so good in Egypt. We had all the food we wanted. We had this and this and this, and here we are, blah, de, da. But they weren't content to be free. They didn't understand what it meant to be free, and they hardened their hearts against God. And we even read in the Bible that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and to have a hardened heart means that we're not open to hearing and receiving God's grace and God's glory. And in this, quoting from Psalm 95, I think it's 95 anyway, 95 verses 7 through 11, but do not harden your hearts as in a rebellion when your fathers tested me, So this is God talking to the people, the Spirit. That's what, the writer says. This is the Spirit talking. This is God speaking through the psalmist, reminding us, as he reminded the Israelites, to be open, to not harden our hearts. And it says, where your fathers tested me, tried me, and saw my works for 40 years. It's a reminder of that, the time that they spent. And he said, and God says, therefore I was angry with that generation because they go astray in their hearts. And it's a reminder for us to be faithful to God, to trust in God's grace and in God's glory, and to know that God is always faithful. And and then the last part, verses 16 through 19, again, talk about the failure of the Israelites as they wandered in the wilderness. and how they rebelled against God. And, you know, by rebelling against God means that they worshipped idols, that they didn't trust God in his promise and his leading. And, you know, to start with, you know, God was leading them by a pillar of fire by night and a cloud in the day. And, you know, he was very evident in leading and guiding, but yet they wanted more. You know, they weren't content with that. So the writer of Hebrews is reminding us of the majesty of Christ, that Christ is our high priest. Christ is the firstborn Son of God. You know, in verse 1, chapter 2, it says he is the heir of all things. You know, that God will grant Christ infinite grace and mercy and glory and honor. Jesus is the one through whom God made the worlds as well, who was in that earlier part. And we see that Jesus is the brightness of God's glory. He is the express image of God. You know, when we see Jesus, we see God. And that's what Jesus said, you know, to the disciples. You know, they wanted to see the Father. And Jesus said in the Gospel of John, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. You know, and so when we look within ourselves to see Jesus, and each of us has a picture of Jesus. And for most of us, the picture of Jesus is a man with, you know, fairly light skin, maybe a little bit darker than ours, long dark hair, and, you know, but who knows? I mean, we have an image of Jesus, and most of us have an image of God, but, you know, no one has seen God. We can, you know, that in the Bible, but Jesus tells us if we've seen him, we've seen God. If we know Jesus and know his love, we know God's love, we know God's grace, we know God's glory. Jesus sits at the right hand of the Majesty on high, and as I talked the last couple of days, Jesus is above the angels. He is the way of our salvation. He's the destroyer of the devil. He is, again, as we started in this chapter, the high priest, and he's worthy of more glory than Moses. So Jesus, the majesty of Jesus, is very evident in this book of Hebrews, and we'll find more of that as we go through some more chapters of the writer of Hebrews giving praise and glory and honor to Jesus. And that's what we are to do too, each and every day, to give praise, honor, and glory to Jesus. I want to thank you for tuning in. You know, some of you tuned in earlier today on other morning's devotions, and see, I got a couple of people listening now, so thank you for tuning in when I get a chance. Tomorrow morning we'll be live from Maywell and Sutton at 9 o'clock. It's first Sunday of the month, All Saints Sunday. We have communion. So if you're at home and would like to share in communion, have wine and a cracker, or juice and a cracker, or whatever, to have communion, you're welcome. So thank you for your patience with me as we continue reading again through the Bible, through the Gospels, and through the New Testament. God's blessings tonight, as always.